The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm amber glow over the rows of metal kennels at Hope Haven Animal Shelter. The fading light stretched long shadows across the cold concrete floor, a quiet reminder that another day had passed. Another day of waiting, hoping, and being overlooked. Hope Haven was a place of second chances, a temporary refuge for the lost and abandoned. But for some, it wasn't temporary at all. Time moved differently here. For the young and energetic, a future existed beyond these walls, a promise of a home, of warm laps and backyard chases. But for the old, the weary, and the forgotten, time wasn't measured in hopeful days, but in how long they could hold on before the inevitable. At the farthest end of the shelter, away from the noise of eager barks and restless paws scratching at metal gates, lay two dogs in the quietest corner of all. They did not whimper for attention or pace anxiously like the younger ones. They did not press their noses against the bars, their eyes filled with desperate longing. No, they had long since stopped hoping for miracles. Max, once a proud and powerful Malinois mix, lay stretched out, his body curled protectively around Bella as he always did. His once mighty frame, now slightly sunken, bore the unmistakable signs of time. His thick coat, once sleek and full, had dulled with age, and his legs, stiff with arthritis, trembled even in stillness. Beside him, Bella, a retriever mix with fur that had once shimmered like spun gold, rested her head on his paw. She had always been the gentler of the two, her soft brown eyes reflecting an enduring kindness, even after all these years. But age had not been kind. Her breathing had grown heavier, her once strong heart struggling with every beat. The world outside had moved on, yet here they remained, silent, waiting, forgotten. 7 years. That's how long they had been here, watching as younger, more vibrant dogs came and went. They had seen puppies, full of life and promise, taken into loving arms. They had seen others like them, older, slower, wait and wait, only to never leave at all. They had seen empty kennels become full, and full kennels empty, yet their own cage remained unchanged. Hope had faded a long time ago. And now, this was it, their final night in the place that had become both home and prison. The shelter was at full capacity, and difficult decisions had to be made. Max and Bella had been moved to the list that no dog ever returned from. Their names were written on a clipboard in the office, marked with a silent and irreversible fate. There were no farewell treats, no extra pets behind the ears. Just the sterile certainty that when the sun rose again, they would not see it. Max shifted slightly, wincing as the movement sent a dull ache through his joints. Bella stirred beside him, her body pressing a little closer, seeking the familiar comfort of the only companion she had left. In their world, words were unnecessary. They spoke in the language of closeness, of shared warmth, of small gestures that whispered, "I'm here. I won't leave you." They had not always been together. Once they had been alone, lost, wandering separate roads that somehow led them to this same place. Max had been found near an abandoned warehouse, skin and bones, his ribs pressing against a too-thin coat. Bella had been picked up on the side of a highway, lying in the dirt, too weak to stand. Two different stories, two different pasts, yet somehow, fate had brought them together, binding them in a way no human could understand. And so, over the years, they had become a unit, a quiet and unwavering presence in each other's lives. They shared meals, curled up against the cold, and on the darkest nights when the shelter was silent and the world felt unbearably vast, they found solace in each other. But tonight, something felt different. There was no tomorrow left to wait for. Max lifted his head slightly, his deep brown eyes flickering toward the door at the end of the corridor. He had seen that door open and close 1,000 times, had watched as the workers came and went. But now, as the evening settled into silence, it felt heavier, as though it held something final. Bella gave a soft sigh, her breath warm against his fur. If she knew what was coming, she didn't show it. Or maybe she did. Maybe that was why she stayed so close, why she nestled into the space beneath his chin just a little tighter. Max curled his body around her, his paws resting protectively over hers, his chin resting on her head. A silent promise. If this was the end, they would face it together. The lights in the shelter dimmed, the staff locking up for the night. Footsteps faded, doors clicked shut, and soon there was nothing but the rhythmic sound of dogs settling into uneasy sleep. But in that quiet corner, Max and Bella did not sleep. They lay awake, pressed close, waiting for the morning they would never see. But fate, as it turned out, had other plans. Dr. Emily Carter stepped into the dimly lit corridor, the clipboard in her hand feeling heavier than it should. She had been a veterinarian for nearly 2 decades, had worked in shelters, clinics, and emergency hospitals, had seen life begin and end in countless ways. She had told herself over the years that she was used to it, that she had learned to accept the harsh realities of her profession. But standing here now, at the farthest end of the shelter, she knew she had been lying to herself. Some things, no matter how many times you faced them, never got easier. The shelter was quiet. The chaos of the day settled into a hushed lull. Most of the dogs had drifted into restless sleep, their soft whimpers and occasional shifting the only sounds in the sterile air. But as Dr. Carter approached the last kennel on the list, a strange stillness settled over her. It was different here, quieter, heavier. The weight of finality lingered like an unseen presence in the small, enclosed space. She exhaled slowly, steeling herself for what came next. The gate creaked softly as she unlatched it, and then she saw them. Max and Bella lay intertwined in a way that made her breath catch in her throat. Max, his aging frame curled protectively around Bella, had both his front legs wrapped around her body in a way that was unmistakable. It wasn't just the closeness of 2 animals seeking warmth or comfort, it was an embrace, a deliberate, undeniable hug. Bella's head was nestled beneath Max's chin, her eyes closed, her body pressed into him as if she could melt into his strength. There was a peaceful resignation in her posture, a silent understanding that words could never capture. Dr. Carter felt a lump form in her throat. She had seen dogs form bonds before, had witnessed friendships between strays, the way they clung to each other in unfamiliar places. But this was something else entirely. This was not just comfort. It was goodbye, a slow, painful goodbye. Her fingers tightened around the clipboard, and she suddenly hated the weight of it in her hands. The list of names, the decisions already made, it all felt so unbearably cold. She had been doing this long enough to know that dogs understood things in ways people often dismissed. They could sense emotions, could feel shifts in energy, could detect fear and sadness with startling accuracy. And now, looking at Max and Bella, she was certain they knew. They knew what was coming, and they had chosen to face it together. She took a small step closer, her legs moving almost without thought, drawn forward by something beyond reason. As she knelt beside them, Max lifted his head, his deep brown eyes locking onto hers. There was no fear in his gaze, no panic, no resistance, just a quiet acceptance. But beneath it, something else lingered. A question, a plea, not for himself, for Bella. Dr. Carter swallowed hard, her vision blurring slightly at the edges. She had always prided herself on keeping a professional distance when it came to cases like this, on not letting emotion cloud what needed to be done. But this moment didn't feel like something she could rationalize away. She reached out instinctively, her fingers brushing gently over Max's head, then down to Bella's soft fur. The retriever's chest rose and fell in a slow, labored rhythm beneath her touch. She was tired, so very tired. And yet, she had not chosen to face this alone. Dr. Carter closed her eyes for a brief second, forcing herself to breathe, to think, to focus. But the moment she reopened them, she knew she couldn't do this. Not yet. Something about it didn't feel right. Something about it made every instinct in her body scream to stop. She looked down at the clipboard again, then at the scanner clipped to her pocket. She had checked their records before, had done so 100 times, had gone through every protocol, every necessary step. But now, as she looked at them, something inside her whispered, "Check again." She hesitated for only a second before making up her mind. "Jess," she called out, her voice a little unsteady. A moment later, footsteps approached from down the hall. The young assistant appeared at the corner, her brows furrowed in concern. "What's wrong?" Dr. Carter didn't look away from Max and Bella as she spoke. "Bring me the scanner." Jess blinked, confused. "We already checked their chips. There's no history, no owner on file." "I know," Dr. Carter interrupted, her voice firmer now. "But I want to check again." Jess hesitated only a moment before nodding and hurrying off. Dr. Carter remained where she was, still kneeling beside them, her hand resting gently against Bella's fur. Max watched her, his body tense but still, as if waiting for something. Maybe, just maybe, he knew that for the first time in 7 years, something was about to change. Jess returned with the scanner in hand, her expression puzzled but obedient. Dr. Carter took the device, her fingers trembling slightly as she powered it on. She wasn't sure what she was expecting. Maybe nothing, maybe just confirmation of what they already knew. But something in the way Max and Bella looked at her made her hesitate, made her feel as if she was on the edge of discovering something far bigger than she could comprehend. She took a steadying breath and pressed the scanner against Max's neck first. A small beep sounded, and the screen lit up with the familiar details. "Max, no known owner, found as a stray." The same information that had always been there. Jess sighed. "Dr. Carter, we already—" "Wait!" Dr. Carter interrupted, her gut telling her not to stop yet. "Let's check Bella." Jess hesitated but nodded, pressing the scanner against Bella's fur. Another beep, another standard response, until suddenly the screen flickered, and a second beep, louder this time, echoed in the quiet space. The air in the room seemed to shift. Jess frowned, leaning in. That's never happened before." Dr. Carter's heart pounded as she glanced at the screen. A new line of text had appeared beneath the usual entry. "Bella, United States Army K-9 unit, classified." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Jess's eyes widened. "What?" Dr. Carter didn't answer. Her fingers moved almost on their own, scanning Max again. This time, the second beep came quicker. "Max, United States Army K-9 unit, classified." Silence hung between them, thick with disbelief. Dr. Carter's mind reeled. How was this possible? These two dogs, two supposed strays, weren't just shelter animals abandoned by careless owners. They were military dogs. They had been trained, deployed, and somewhere along the way, lost. But how had they ended up here? How had they gone unnoticed for so long? Jess finally found her voice. They're not just strays," she whispered. "They're soldiers." Dr. Carter could hardly breathe. The weight of what they had just uncovered settled over her like a crushing force. She needed answers. With shaking hands, she pulled out her tablet and logged into the military's public database. As a veterinarian, she had limited access to classified records, but if Max and Bella were once registered K-9s, there had to be some trace of them. Her fingers flew across the screen as she typed in the identification numbers displayed on the scanner. A few seconds passed. Then the screen flashed, and a file opened. There they were, two profiles, side by side. K-9 unit, Max and Bella. Status, missing in action, presumed deceased. Last deployment, Middle East conflict zone, classified operations. Dr. Carter swallowed hard, her pulse thundering in her ears. Max and Bella hadn't just been lost. They had been left behind. A lump formed in her throat as she scrolled further, skimming through lines of dense military text until something caught her eye. A video file dated nearly 7 years ago. Her hands trembled as she clicked play. The screen flickered, and suddenly, they weren't in the shelter anymore. They were in a war zone. The footage was grainy, taken from the body camera of a soldier. Dust and smoke filled the air as a convoy of soldiers moved cautiously through an abandoned village, their weapons raised. In the midst of them, 2 dogs darted between the troops, alert, focused, moving with purpose. Bella was the first to react. In the video, she froze, her ears twitching, body stiffening. A second later, she lunged forward, barking frantically toward a pile of rubble. The soldiers hesitated. Then chaos erupted. An explosion. The camera shook violently, static breaking through the audio. Dust and debris filled the screen, soldiers shouting as they scrambled for cover. Through the smoke, Bella reappeared, unharmed but wild-eyed, barking urgently toward something off-camera. Then, Max. Through the thick clouds of dirt and destruction, Max's silhouette emerged, dragging a wounded soldier by the vest strap, pulling him out of harm's way. Jess gasped. "Oh my God!" Dr. Carter couldn't look away. The soldier, his face obscured by dirt and blood, reached out, grabbing Max's fur as if anchoring himself to life. The screen flickered again. This time the scene had changed. The battlefield was quieter, the sun setting behind a makeshift camp. Soldiers sat in groups, tending to wounds, murmuring in hushed voices. The camera panned to a figure crouching between 2 dogs. A man. His uniform was dusty, his face lined with exhaustion, but his eyes were soft as he stroked their fur. Nathan Reynolds. Dr. Carter exhaled sharply. She didn't know him, but his name was in their records. Max and Bella's handler. The video was old, but the way he looked at them, it was clear. They had been his, and he had been theirs. Nathan's voice was tired but warm as he murmured to them. "You did good today," he said softly. "You always do." He scratched behind Bella's ears, then rested a hand on Max's broad head. For a moment he was quiet. Then he whispered, "We're a family. I'll never leave you behind." The screen froze. And just like that, it was over. Dr. Carter's stomach twisted, because she knew what had happened next. Somewhere between that moment and now, between the promise and the present, they had been separated, lost, declared dead. And somehow, some way, they had survived. 7 years. 7 years of waiting, of searching, of believing that one day their person would come back for them. Dr. Carter wiped at her eyes and took a shaky breath. "We have to find him," she whispered. Jess nodded, still stunned. "We have to tell the military." Dr. Carter looked down at Max and Bella, still curled together in the kennel. They didn't know what had just been uncovered, didn't know how close they had come to slipping through the cracks forever. But Max lifted his head, his deep brown eyes meeting hers. And for the first time, she thought maybe he did know. Maybe he had been waiting for this moment all along. The war had taken everything from them. One moment, Max and Bella had been part of something bigger. A unit, a team, a family. The next, they were lost in a foreign land, separated from their handler, abandoned amidst the chaos of battle. The sound of gunfire, the smell of burning debris, and the desperate cries of soldiers had been their last memories before the world had gone silent. And then, there had been nothing but the desert. The heat was relentless, pressing down on them like an invisible force. The sun an unyielding tormentor in the vast emptiness of sand and sky. The wind howled at night, sweeping across the barren land like a ghostly whisper, stirring up dust that coated their fur and burned their throats. There was no food, no water, only endless dunes stretching far beyond the horizon. Max led the way, his body aching from exhaustion, his paws cracked from the scorching ground. But he did not stop. He couldn't. Bella, smaller and weaker, was struggling. Her breaths had grown shallow, her once strong legs trembling beneath her. She had suffered a deep gash during the attack, the wound caked with dirt and blood. Every step was agony, but she followed Max, trusting him with every fiber of her being. When night fell, the cold was as brutal as the heat had been. Bella curled into herself, shivering uncontrollably. Max pressed his body against hers, shielding her from the harsh wind, his warmth the only comfort she had left. He licked her wound gently, his instincts overriding his exhaustion. She had saved him once, long ago, and now it was his turn to protect her. Days passed in a blur. Hunger gnawed at them, thirst clawing at their throats. They had stopped barking long ago, their voices dried up by the relentless desert air. Their movements became sluggish, their pace slowing to a crawl. But then a miracle. Max smelled it first, the faintest scent of water carried by the wind. His ears perked, his instincts sharpening despite his fatigue. He nudged Bella, urging her forward. With what little strength they had left, they moved toward the scent, their bodies weak but their determination unwavering. And then, there it was, a small oasis hidden between the dunes. The water was murky, but it was water. Bella collapsed beside it, lapping at the liquid with what little energy she had left. Max stood watch as she drank, his body rigid with caution, his ears twitching at every distant sound. He had always been the protector, and even now, on the edge of survival, he refused to let his guard down. For days they remained near the water, regaining their strength. Bella's wound began to heal, though she would always carry the scar. Max hunted small prey, sharing every bite with her. They had survived the impossible, and yet they were still lost. There was no sign of their unit, no familiar scent of their handler. But Max refused to give up. They traveled at night, avoiding the brutal heat of the sun, moving in the direction of the distant lights on the horizon. Civilization, safety, hope. When they finally stumbled upon a small village, the locals eyed them warily. Stray dogs were not uncommon, but there was something different about Max and Bella. They carried themselves with purpose, with discipline. They were not like the scavengers that lurked in alleyways, nor the wild dogs that roamed in packs. They were something else. A kind man took pity on them, offering scraps of food and a place to rest. It was there, in the shadowed alleys of the village, that they found their next chance at survival, a cargo ship. The docks were busy, the air thick with the scent of salt and fish. Max and Bella moved carefully, staying hidden in the shadows. They had no understanding of the human world beyond their training, but they knew instinctively that they had to get on that ship. It was their only way out. The opportunity came when a group of workers left a loading crate unattended. Max nudged Bella forward, his silent command clear. They climbed inside, the smell of rust and oil strong in their noses. A moment later, the crate was lifted, sealed, and moved onto the ship. They were leaving. The journey across the ocean was long, filled with hunger and uncertainty. The metal walls of the container trapped them in darkness, the rocking of the ship their only indication that they were moving. They slept in shifts, their bodies pressed together for warmth, their ears always alert for danger. And then, after what felt like a lifetime, the scent of home. The ship docked in the United States, its cargo unloaded with routine efficiency. Max and Bella waited until nightfall before making their escape, slipping into the city unnoticed. The streets were a foreign world to them, bright lights, loud noises, the overwhelming scent of humans and gasoline. But there was no one waiting for them. No handler, no soldiers, no unit. They were ghosts, slipping through alleyways, scavenging for food, watching as life moved on without them. Years passed. Their fur grew grayer, their movements slower. They learned to navigate the city, avoiding danger, surviving in the way only soldiers knew how. They stayed together, always. Max protected Bella, and Bella kept Max going when the weight of it all threatened to break him. They had become forgotten souls, lost in a world that no longer knew their names, until fate led them to the shelter, until the day a kind-hearted stranger found them curled up in an abandoned lot, too weak to run, too tired to fight. Hope Haven Animal Shelter became their new prison, their new waiting ground. They watched as younger dogs were chosen, as people walked past them without a second glance. They no longer expected rescue. They no longer believed in miracles. But then, after 7 years, the past had found them again. And everything was about to change. The morning air was crisp, carrying the distant hum of the city beyond the quiet confines of Hope Haven Animal Shelter. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the wire fencing, casting soft golden streaks across the cold concrete. The shelter was waking up, but today, something was different. A military vehicle rolled to a stop just outside the shelter gates, its deep green exterior polished and unmistakable. The tires crunched against the gravel, sending small clouds of dust into the air. The hum of the engine cut off, and for a long moment, there was only silence. Then, the door swung open. A man stepped out, his tall frame still carrying the disciplined posture of a soldier despite the weight of years that had settled on his shoulders. His once dark hair was streaked with gray, his uniform neatly pressed but worn with time. His boots, though polished, bore the scuffs of long-forgotten battlefields. But it was his eyes, deep, weary, yet filled with something unspoken, that held the most weight. Nathan Reynolds had spent years believing that this day would never come. He had searched. He had begged for answers. He had gone through every official channel, every dead-end lead, trying to find out what had happened to his dogs, his team, his family. But the reports had all been the same: missing in action, presumed dead. He had mourned them, and yet, here he was, standing on the threshold of the impossible. Dr. Emily Carter was already waiting for him by the shelter's entrance, her expression unreadable as she took him in. She had seen a lot of things in her years at the shelter, had witnessed heartbreak, joy, and everything in between. But this was something rare, something delicate, something that felt almost sacred. "Sergeant Reynolds," she said softly, nodding toward him. He tore his eyes away from the building, clearing his throat before speaking. "They're really here?" His voice was gruff, rougher than he intended, thick with something he couldn't quite suppress. Dr. Carter nodded, glancing toward the corridor that led to the kennels. "They're here." Nathan inhaled sharply, then started forward. His footsteps were measured, steady, but each step felt heavier than the last. He didn't know what to expect. Would they remember him? Would they be the same? Time changed things. He had seen it before, seen it in men, in war, in himself. 7 years was a lifetime. As he reached the end of the hall, Dr. Carter unlocked the final kennel door. Max and Bella lay curled together, just as they always had. They didn't stir at first. Accustomed to the routine sounds of the shelter, their bodies pressed close in quiet companionship. But then, Nathan. His voice wasn't loud, wasn't commanding. It was gentle, familiar. A whisper pulled from the past, from a place long buried but never truly gone. Bella lifted her head first. Her ears twitched, her body stiffening as recognition flashed across her tired eyes. Her breathing quickened, and for a split second there was hesitation, like a dream one wasn't sure was real. Then her nose flared, catching his scent. And she knew. With a sharp, keening whimper, She scrambled to her feet, nearly stumbling in her haste. Her paws skidded against the floor as she launched herself forward, her tail wagging so hard it looked like it might send her toppling over. The sound that tore from her throat was raw, high-pitched, an aching cry of lost time. Nathan barely had time to brace himself before she crashed into him, pressing her face against his chest, her entire body trembling with emotion. "Hey, sweetheart," he murmured, his voice breaking as he knelt to her level, his arms wrapping tightly around her. "I missed you too." Bella whimpered, her head nuzzling into the crook of his neck, as if she could press herself into him, as if she could reclaim the years they had lost. And then there was Max. Unlike Bella, he hadn't moved. He sat where he was, his head lifted, his deep brown eyes locked onto Nathan. There was no rush of movement, no sudden burst of energy. There was only silence, but something was shifting. Max's body was tense, his breath shallow. His eyes searched Nathan's face, his expression unreadable, caught between disbelief and something deeper, something fragile. Nathan swallowed, slowly reaching into his pocket. He pulled out an old, worn collar, the same one Max had worn all those years ago, the one that had once been as much a part of him as the fur on his back. The nameplate was still there, though tarnished with time. "Remember this?" Nathan whispered, holding it out. Max's ears flicked, his nostrils flared. And then a sound rumbled from his chest. Not a growl, not a bark, a whimper. The dam broke. Max surged forward, his legs moving before his mind could catch up, and suddenly he was there, pressing his massive frame against Nathan, his head tucking into the crook of the man's shoulder. Nathan sucked in a sharp breath, his arms coming around both dogs, his fingers gripping their fur like an anchor, like if he held on tight enough, he could undo the years of separation, of loneliness, of waiting. "I thought I lost you," he whispered, pressing his forehead against Max's. Max let out a deep, shuddering sigh, his body finally relaxing, his tail thumping weakly against the floor. Dr. Carter and Jess stood frozen in the doorway, their throats tight, their eyes glassy with unshed tears. The shelter, usually filled with barking and movement, had gone silent. The other dogs had stopped, as if sensing the gravity of this moment, as if they, too, understood that something rare and sacred was unfolding before them. No one spoke. No one moved. Because in that moment, it wasn't just a reunion. It was a homecoming, a promise kept, against all odds, a family, finally whole again. The air inside the shelter was still thick with emotion, the weight of the reunion settling into the hearts of everyone who had witnessed it. Nathan Reynolds remained kneeling between Max and Bella, his hands buried deep in their fur, as if afraid that if he let go, they might vanish again. The silence was almost reverent, a moment of pure, undisturbed peace. And then, the alarm. A shrill, piercing sound cut through the quiet, like a knife. Dr. Carter's head snapped up just as the scent of smoke reached her nose. Her heart lurched. Something was wrong. A second later, Jess burst into the corridor, eyes wide with panic. "Fire!" she gasped. "It's in the back room!" The realization hit like a shockwave. The back room. That was where the storage area was, stacked high with old bedding, supplies, and chemicals. If a fire had started there, it could spread fast. Nathan was already on his feet. "Where's the nearest extinguisher?" he barked, shifting into the crisp authority of a soldier. Dr. Carter didn't answer. Her focus had snapped elsewhere, to the rising cacophony of panicked barking. The dogs, the ones still in their kennels, trapped with no way to escape. Jess spun toward the exit. "I'll call the fire department!" Smoke curled through the air, dark tendrils creeping along the ceiling. And then a sound cut through the chaos, a sharp, terrified yelp. Dr. Carter turned toward the far end of the corridor, her stomach twisting. One of the puppies, barely a few months old, was still in the last row of kennels. The fire was growing, flames licking hungrily along the wooden beams above. It wouldn't take long for the entire area to be engulfed. The pup cried again, clawing at the bars, too small to push its way out. And then, before anyone could react, Max moved. His old legs should have slowed him. His arthritis should have held him back. But instinct overrode age, and in the blink of an eye, he was gone, racing straight into the smoke. "Max!" Nathan shouted, lunging forward to grab him, but it was too late. Bella was a heartbeat behind. They didn't hesitate. They didn't stop to think. They were soldiers. Even now, even after all this time, they knew what had to be done. Nathan cursed under his breath, moving to follow. But Dr. Carter grabbed his arm. "You can't," she warned, coughing against the thickening smoke. "It's too dangerous." Nathan clenched his jaw. His instincts screamed at him to chase after them, to not let them out of his sight again. Not after he had just gotten them back. But deep down, he knew. Max and Bella had never needed saving. They had always been the ones doing the saving. Inside the thick haze, Max reached the cage first. The little puppy was whimpering, pressing itself against the farthest corner, too scared to move. Flames flickered along the base of the walls, creeping closer. Max growled, low and commanding, before snapping his jaws around the kennel's metal latch. He yanked once, twice, but it wouldn't budge. His arthritic legs trembled beneath him, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Bella darted past him, moving toward the opposite side of the room. Through the thick smoke, she saw another form, small, shaking. A blind dog, its cloudy eyes wide with fear, pressed against the far wall, trapped. The fire was closing in. With no time to waste, Bella nudged the frightened dog, pushing against it with her nose. It resisted at first, frozen with fear, but Bella let out a short, reassuring whine. "Trust me," she seemed to say. "Follow me." And then, crack. A section of the ceiling collapsed, sending embers flying. The heat intensified. Time was running out. Max snarled, tightening his grip on the cage door, and with one final, desperate yank, the latch gave way. The puppy tumbled forward, squealing in fear, but Max was there, grabbing the scruff of its neck between his teeth and pulling it into the open. Bella was already weaving her way back through the smoke, guiding the blind dog with careful nudges, keeping her body close so it could follow her lead. Together, the four of them moved. Outside, Nathan stood rigid, his fists clenched as the smoke thickened. He was ready to rush in, consequences be damned. But then, through the haze, a shadow. Max emerged first, his body low, his movements strained but determined. The small puppy dangled from his mouth, unharmed. A moment later, Bella followed, her flank pressed against the blind dog, guiding it carefully forward. Relief hit Nathan so hard that he nearly collapsed. Dr. Carter let out a shaky breath, rushing forward to help. Jess was beside her in an instant, taking the trembling puppy from Max's mouth, wrapping it in a blanket. The blind dog whimpered, pressing its nose against Bella's fur before being led safely away. Max exhaled a heavy, tired sigh. His legs wobbled beneath him. Bella collapsed onto her side, panting hard, her body coated in soot. Nathan was on his knees before them in an instant, his hands running over them, checking for injuries. "You crazy, stubborn dogs," he muttered, his voice thick with emotion. Max simply lifted his head, pressing his muzzle into Nathan's chest. Bella gave a weak wag of her tail. They had done it. They had saved them. The fire was extinguished minutes later, the flames never reaching the main kennels. The shelter was safe. The dogs were safe. And as Nathan sat there, one hand on Max, the other on Bella, he realized something. They had spent years surviving, years fighting to stay alive in a world that had forgotten them. But they had never forgotten who they were. They weren't just survivors. They were protectors. And even now, long after the battlefield, long after the war, they were still heroes. The weeks that followed were filled with quiet miracles. Max and Bella were no longer just forgotten shelter dogs waiting for their final day. They were recognized, honored, and given a second chance at the life they had once known. A life of dignity, care, and above all, love. The transition to the veteran K-9 retirement center was smoother than anyone expected. Despite their old age and the years spent in solitude, there was something familiar about the structured environment. The crisp morning air, the sound of boots on gravel, the rhythmic commands from handlers. They had lived this life before, and in some ways it was like coming home. Nathan was there every step of the way. At first he had worried. They were older now, slower. Bella's heart condition required careful monitoring, and Max's arthritis made it harder for him to move like he once did. But despite their bodies showing signs of time's relentless march, their spirits remained as strong as ever. Each morning, Nathan arrived at the center just as the sun crested over the treetops. He found them waiting for him, always together, their tails wagging the moment they saw him. Their routines became sacred, long, slow walks beneath the towering oak trees, where Max would stop to sniff at every patch of grass as if cataloging every scent, and Bella would nudge Nathan's hand for gentle pats, her soft brown eyes filled with quiet contentment. They weren't soldiers anymore. They didn't have to be. For the first time in years, they could simply exist, not as protectors, not as warriors, but as two souls who had finally found peace. Dr. Carter visited often. She had seen hundreds of animals come and go, had spent years in a profession that forced her to make impossible decisions. But Max and Bella, she couldn't forget them. She often found herself sitting beside them in the late afternoons, watching as they dozed in the sunlight. Every time she saw Max rest his head on Bella's back, every time she caught them curled together the way they had been in the shelter, she remembered that night, the night she had nearly let them go. She shuddered at the thought. Fate had intervened in ways none of them could have expected. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold, Nathan sat with them on the porch of the retirement center. Bella's head rested on his knee, her breaths slow but steady. Max lay stretched out beside them, his body heavy with the kind of exhaustion that came not from pain, but from contentment. Nathan ran a hand through Max's thick fur, his touch gentle. "You did good, buddy," he murmured. Max's ears twitched at the familiar words, a flicker of recognition passing through his tired eyes. Beside him, Bella let out a soft sigh, shifting closer to Max. Their bodies pressed together just as they had always been. They had traveled far. They had fought, survived, and endured more than most ever would. And now, at long last, they were home. For the first time in years. They were no longer alone. The story of Max and Bella is more than just a tale of survival. It is a testament to the unbreakable bonds of loyalty, love, and resilience. It is a reminder that even in the darkest moments, even when all hope seems lost, fate has a way of intervening. For years they were forgotten, left to drift in a world that no longer remembered their names, and yet they never stopped protecting, never stopped caring. Whether it was for each other, for the frightened puppy trapped in the fire, or for the soldiers they had once served beside, their instinct was always to shield, to comfort, to love. Because that's what true heroes do. They fight not for themselves, but for those who cannot fight for themselves. There is a saying, "The greatest souls are not those who seek to be remembered, but those who never stop giving, even when the world has forgotten them." Max and Bella lived by this truth. They did not ask for recognition. They did not demand a reward. They simply remained, steadfast, devoted, bound by a loyalty that transcended time and circumstance. Their journey reminds us that love, in its purest form, is about presence. It is about standing by someone when the world turns away. It is about holding on, even when everything else has let go. And in the end, they were not just rescued. They were seen. They were remembered. They were given the home they had always deserved. Because no soul, no matter how old, no matter how weary, should ever fade into the shadows of forgotten history. Some bonds, some loves, are simply meant to endure. Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another amazing story. Together, we can shine a light on the power of doing what's right. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.